One Piece is one of the easiest series to get into, even if you're starting from the beginning and you want to watch all 1100 episodes. But people will tell you that getting into the series is a nightmare, or even worse, they'll say that One Piece is actually boring. And yet somehow it's one of the best-selling stories of all time, never mind manga. See, the popular opinion, at least with a lot of people, is that One Piece doesn't get good until at least Alabasta, maybe even as far as Water 7 and Enies Lobby. And there's always at least 3 reasons why people say One Piece isn't that good. First of all, they'll say that the pacing sucks. And right away, this gets us into an anime versus manga conversation. Because I've read the manga more than a few times, and I don't know what people are talking about, because that stuff flies. For a frame of reference, by the time you finish Arlong Park, you've read just about 100 chapters. Now for me, that was the easiest 100 chapters I've ever read. But in the anime, it takes something like 44 episodes. Which, if this were a seasonal anime, would be well over 2 seasons. And look, I get it. That is kind of a long time, especially in this day and age of everything being seasonal. And I could say, oh well, you should just read the manga, but let's be honest, I started out with the anime and a lot of people do too. And more people are gonna watch the anime over the manga. So to that point, if you're watching the anime, I can't argue with its clear flaws. Yes, it does take 30 episodes to get to what most people would say is the first major arc. And yes, that's made worse by the old weekly format and the fact that they practically adapt 1 chapter per episode. But once you get past how long of an investment it is, early One Piece is so much fun. In recent years, I had always just assumed One Piece was a slow burn, and yet I always knew that this was the same stuff that made me fall in love with the series well before Alabasta and Enies Lobby. So when I went back and started the series from chapter 1, I was shocked at just how exciting these first few arcs really are. Obviously, you have Romance Dawn, which in my opinion is one of, if not the best, first chapters in any manga, which also has Zoro's introduction where he gets crucified basically for standing up for a little girl, and then shows off his 3-sword style, cueing readers into the fact that he's a total badass. Orange Town comes next, and it's pretty cool. You have the story with the dog Chow Chow, who's basically the One Piece version of the real-life dog Hachiko. You also get Nami, and then Buggy, who, as weird as he is revealed to be an old crewmate of Shanks. Then you get to Syrup Village, the arc where we meet Usopp, who is pretty bonkers but quickly becomes a lot of people's favorite character. You also get Kuro, who is the first real threat to Luffy because they specifically point out how Luffy's really only weak to slashes and stabs, and then guess what? A character who specializes in that shows up. Then we get Baratie, which honestly gets better every time I read it. Admittedly, the villains of this arc are pretty lame. To be honest, they're really only there to show you how you could have an entire military but still not make it on the Grand Line, which is demonstrated by the fact that they get absolutely decimated by a lone swordsman. And that lone swordsman is of course Mihawk. And how cool is it that we're this early in the story and Zoro is already face to face with the so-called strongest swordsman in the entire world. And then Zoro, the guy who's always a badass, gets completely destroyed. But then we see how he deals with that and how it only strengthens his resolve. But better than any of that, we get the story of Zeph and Sanji. We see how Sanji treats everyone equally, well, sort of. And we get one of the most iconic backstories in the entire story, which in the anime gets censored a bit, but in the manga it's even more intense because you find out that Zeph broke his own foot off for survival. And then, of course, we get Arlong Park. And I could go on about how it sets up the warlords, or how it creates this threat of the fishmen taking over the entire East Blue, or how it creates this insane twist where the crew has to split up and Nami is revealed to be working for the villain. But all I need to mention are Nami crying and the walk to Arlong Park. To this day, the walk to Arlong Park is still one of the most iconic moments in all of anime. And that's in the so-called boring part of One Piece. And it's even more so in the case of the anime, which we all agree has more problems than the manga. So if you sit there and you're like, oh, One Piece is boring, it just makes everyone else wonder, what made you like One Piece in the first place? Like, all this exciting stuff goes on between cool fights, cool characters, and tons of emotional character moments. Sure, it takes course over 100 chapters or 44 episodes, but how anyone can watch this story and not say it was worth the investment is beyond me, especially if they then say that it gets good afterward. But I'm not blind, I do see where people are coming from, because on top of the pacing issue, another issue people have are the stakes. But before I say more on that, make sure to like the video if you're enjoying it so far. It's the easiest way to support the channel, and it helps spread the video to other viewers like you.
I've ever seen in my life. The first 50 episodes, week 7.
Now, when people say early One Piece has no stakes, it could be one of two things. First of all, I talked about this earlier on one of my previous streams, but once you start getting into One Piece, early on you get this feeling like Luffy never really loses. Like, this man always catches W's, which to me is refreshing. I think it makes Luffy a fun character, but I also respect the feeling from some people that it kills the stakes, or as I call it, the tension. But the other side to that is the fact that nobody really dies. This is popularly referred to with the rule of P in characters like Pell, but it was an issue before Alabasta. As people will point out, none of the villains are ever killed, and none of the side characters like Gin or anyone else die. It's only characters that have already died in flashbacks, meaning that in the present, you start to feel conditioned that none of the characters will ever die. Now, I'm not going to deep dive into where this specifically becomes a problem, but I will say it's not that big a deal until you get to Baroque Works, which by then you're already invested for everything else. But on that note, yeah, character deaths are a big problem in One Piece. They're executed masterfully in flashbacks, and terribly in the actual present. I won't argue that because it's just a fact. That being said, like I just said, this isn't a problem until Baroque Works, which is much later in the story. Plus, there is plenty of tension. Sure, the villains are pretty goofy in early One Piece, but that doesn't mean there aren't intense fights. It's part of a larger discussion where people confuse stakes and tension when really tension is all you need. But the bottom line is early One Piece has plenty of tension. There's tension in the first chapter with Shanks. There's tension when you meet the pirate hunter that's tied to a cross. When Luffy fights a villain that can actually hurt him. When Zoro almost dies. When Nami loses all her money, and when Luffy fights Arlong. The fights can be goofy and admittedly a bit one-sided, but early One Piece has so much more than the fights, and there's plenty of tension. I can't make you think there's stakes, but to say it's boring kinda ignores all of the other stuff going on in the story. Now, we've talked about pacing, we've talked about stakes, but the third thing a lot of people take issue with are the characters. Namely, that it takes a long time for them to get good. Now, that's how other people would put it. They'll say, yeah, this character's interesting, but it's not until later that they get real development, or it's not until later that they get good. For example, one character you see people say this about is Usopp. They'll say that they thought he was weird or dorky or just plain annoying. But see, the thing with Usopp is that everybody eventually likes him. So I can understand if you don't like him at first, but he pretty quickly becomes one of your favorites. A more serious example is Sanji, because Sanji is probably the most divisive of all the Straw Hats. You either hate him or love him. And for people who hate him, it's because he's goofy, and he's absurdly obsessed with women in a way that makes his character feel outdated at times. But those people will concede that they eventually like his character once they get used to him. And look, I get it. Sanji can be weird. He can even be undefendable at times. But are you telling me you didn't love those parts of his character where he made a wannabe restaurant snob look like a total moron, when he fed a complete stranger because he knows what it's like to almost starve to death, his emotional backstory with Zeph, the charming relationship he has with his adopted father and their tearful goodbye, the way he lights up whenever he talks about All Blue? Now, am I saying he's a perfect character? Of course not. In fact, he's not even in my top 3 for the Straw Hats. But when someone tells me they didn't like Barity or they don't like Sanji at all, I have to wonder if we're watching the same story. Because I thought he was awesome. I still think about that backstory like, I don't know, like 10 years ago, I think I saw it for the first time. And the same is true for the other characters. One Piece has amazing characters. And sure, it does take a while for them to get fleshed out, but their initial introductions are incredible. And with everyone talking about how boring the story is, it only goes to show how these characters carry that story early on. And nobody does this better than Luffy. And yet, some people don't like Luffy either. And I think that's wild. Because to me, Luffy is one of the most charming characters in all of One Piece. With other stories, I'm hesitant to say the main character is the most interesting. In fact, in a lot of cases, they tend to be some of the least interesting. But in the case of One Piece, Luffy really is one of my favorite characters. But obviously, not everyone agrees. First of all, people will say Luffy is dumb, and they find that unfunny or annoying. And while Luffy is definitely a simple character, that's part of his charm. Maybe you don't find it funny, but the fact that Luffy doesn't overthink things makes him a refreshing character. Plus, maybe he isn't a genius, but Luffy is shown to have tons of emotional intelligence early on. He decides he likes Zoro because of how he stands up for the little girl. He treats children like people rather than dumb kids. He sees the good in Sanji. He even stands up for Nami, admits that he needs his crew to make up for the things he can't do, and has the maturity to know that Nami can't grow past her trauma until Arlong Park and what it stands for is ripped to pieces. You have tons of moments like this in early One Piece, and yet people will still call Luffy dumb, which to this day still baffles me. The other thing people will say is that Luffy is a flat character, that he's a boring character because he doesn't grow. And while this is somewhat true in early One Piece, this is a gross oversimplification of his character. Again, Luffy is refreshing because of how simple he is. His perspective is meant to influence the world around him, so of course he doesn't drastically change as a character early on. That's just who he is. Also, maybe he doesn't have growth that's spelled out in black and white, but he does grow in these early arcs. Like I said, after he gathers his crew, he openly admits that he wouldn't be able to carry out his dream if he didn't have their support. Is this a drastic change in his character? Of course not. But it's a sign of Luffy maturing as a character, even if it's only a slight change. I get it if you don't like this about Luffy, but to say he has no depth or no growth at all completely ignores the nuances of his character. And this is part of why I think a lot of One Piece criticism stems from people not taking the time to properly enjoy the story. Now, don't get me wrong, One Piece isn't perfect. In fact, I think it definitely deserves its fair share of criticism. But when you have people saying that one of the best-selling stories of all time doesn't get good until much later, clearly we're missing something. Part of this is because when you have thousands of people hyping up the endgame, you want to rush all the early parts. Naturally, by doing that, you're going to feel chained down by the pacing, and by that point you're going to be pissed off that Michael Bay isn't making everything explode and everyone isn't dying left and right like an episode of Game of Thrones. But when you actually take the time to enjoy each chapter of One Piece on its own, then you start to enjoy it at your own pace and appreciate all the small details. So here's my advice to anyone starting out or to anyone looking back on One Piece. Put your phone away. Shut out all the noise. Just sit down. Don't make it a project. Don't try and watch X amount of episodes a day. Just take the time to read or watch the story and enjoy it at your own pace. If you do that, then hopefully you'll start to understand the charm of One Piece and understand why its first arcs are some of the best. And that's it. Now I'd like to hear what you think. What was your first impression of One Piece? How would you rate it today? Share your thoughts and see what everyone else has to say down in the comments. I'll pick my favorite and share it as comment of the week on my community tab. And if you'd like another discussion like this one, then check out my video on One Piece's art style. In that video, I discuss One Piece's artistic evolution. You can find that video in the playlist linked right here. Until then, thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.